Well, I'd like to welcome you. I'm Jonathan Lear, Director of the Neubauer Collegium for Culture and Society. So I'm welcoming alumni back to the university, but I'm sure I'm welcoming alumni here for the first time because we opened this building only about a month ago. The Neubauer Collegium is a brand new, it's a couple years old now, research institution that's been set up inside the University of Chicago to promote collaborative research work and imaginative new projects in the humanities and the humanistic social sciences. Just like to say one word about that. I don't think this is not, we don't exist because interdisciplinarity is now in vogue. We exist, I think, because when we wish to ask and answer very, very basic questions, there are two, I think, very different postures of the human mind that we use to approach problems. And one is a posture of the human mind that I associate with the social sciences, which is an attempt to keep the inquiring subject at a respectful distance from what he or she is studying. And much work goes in the social sciences to figuring out what are valid ways of, you might say, the objective investigation of natural phenomena, in particular human movements and doings. The humanities, by contrast, I think is a very different posture of the mind, where we, far from caring so much about a rigorous separation between the subject who's doing the inquiring and the object of inquiry, the subject and object come together in the humanities, where when we read a great Shakespeare play or we come into a class or read a great essay about Shakespeare, we hope to be changed by it. And the idea that that the distance between subject and object collapses and should collapse, I think goes very much to the heart of the humanities. And so you're going to hear one example today, but as we pose complex and interesting questions for ourselves, I think we find that it's great to have people able to talk with each other who embody both of these postures of the mind. And of course, I've made the distinction really in some sense only to undo it, because it's not as though the social sciences sometimes do want to do that kind of collapse, and in the humanities sometimes there is an insistence on a kind of a distance. But the Neubauer Collegium sort of burst into existence. We fund these, I think, very, very imaginative projects. You're going to hear about one of them today. Right now, we have 32 projects up and running. This is just one example of it. And the other thing we do is that we invite visiting fellows in from all around the world to join these collaborative projects. And I hope afterwards, if you have time, you'll go and wander around and take a look upstairs, because we have offices for people. And we've only been in this building for a month, but all of our offices are full from people from as far away as China and India, as well as Harvard, which also seems a long way away, but different kind of distance. Today, you're going to hear a project, one of our projects, the participants in the research project, and I think it's a very wonderful example of the kinds of things that we are sponsoring. This is called The Past for Sale. It's about, you'll hear about it in a moment, but it's about the issue of looting of archaeological goods, and sort of how do they get from somewhere in the ground, somewhere in Asia or the Middle East, you might say, into the Getty Museum or some other place. There's a long, complicated route. And, and I think you can, as soon as you start to think about it, you can see that this has got a humanities and a social science component to it. On the one hand, there's the human search for meaning, which goes so deep into the kinds of creatures we are. I think it's just an astonishing fact about us that we have this ability. I mean, if you're walking along and you happen to see a shard of a pot on the ground, you can tell the difference between an artifact, something that's man-made, something that's got meaning in it, even if you don't know what it was, even if you don't know what the culture was, even if you have no idea what the inscription is, we just have this uncanny ability to see, a human made this. A human inscribed this. We know the difference between a swirl that the wind made and a swirl that a human hand made. And immediately we're attracted to it. There's something about finding that shard, that meaningful piece of the past. We want to know more about it. We want to know the people who made it. We want to know about their lives. That very meaningfulness, I think that is, I think, a very humanistic impulse within us. But then it's also true about us that from that very core fact about us, it attains a kind of value that then puts it into a market, that then makes it viable for looting, that makes it sets it into a very, very complicated economic network that if you want to make a difference to try and change the way things are going, you need a lot of different kinds of thinkers approaching this problem. So this Past for Sale project has archaeologists, anthropologists, economists, policymakers, people from the social services administration. It's bringing together scholars of all sorts of disciplines, all sorts of areas, and visitors from and interlocutors from around the world. This is exactly the kind of project that we are sponsoring at the Neubauer Collegium. So I'm really, really delighted to introduce the Collegium to you via this project. I just want to introduce. I'll tell you we'll have two speakers and a third who won't speak, but will be moderating and joining in the discussion. Gil Stein is the head of the Oriental Institute, which is one of our neighbors and collaborators. Professor Larry Rothfield is a professor of English and one of the principal investigators of this project. And Fiona Rose Greenland is associate director of this project and keeps the whole project online and going. Over to you. Thank you very much.
Well, can everyone hear me? Fortunately, this is a small enough room that should not be a problem. I think Jonathan has outlined the scope of what the Neubauer Collegium's mission is, and the idea of engaging with very, very large-scale, highly complex problems is it's a real challenge across the board. And the way universities are set up with their structure of departments actually in some cases can inhibit our getting greater clarity on them. And the Neubauer Collegium is a remarkable effort at bridging across the different departments to synthesize knowledge on very, very targeted project-specific questions. Now, the element I wanted to add to what Jonathan said is that of urgency, that we're very accustomed to thinking of universities as ivory towers, where the term, I think, omphalos is the contemplation of one's navel as a mystical act. Well, you know, the generally or widely held perception of universities is that there's a lot of naval contemplation going on. But in fact, one of the things that universities do is they engage with very, very urgent questions that impact quite directly on people's lives. And the Past for Sale project is, I would argue, one of that class of problems, challenges, issues that is complex, it's multidisciplinary, and it's very urgent. Why is it urgent? Because what we're dealing with is the global threat to cultural heritage. Again, cultural heritage can sound like a very abstract concept. It is, broadly speaking, it's a set of institutions and practices, both material and intangible, that define a culture that are passed down from one generation to the next. So cultural heritage is really not only specific to a given culture or civilization, but it's really world heritage because civilizations have interacted over time. If we live in cities because cities first developed in Mesopotamia 5,000 years ago, and that legacy of urban life, that legacy of writing, that legacy of states and governments and, well, unfortunately, bureaucracy as well, all of those are part of our shared cultural heritage. So an assault on cultural heritage is not just attacking the stuff that belongs to the people in Kurdistan. It's stuff that is our shared human history. So that's the first point. The second point is that the way we need to think about cultural heritage is that it's a non-renewable resource. This is the material evidence of how we got to be who we are. And once it's gone forever. Now, the world cultural heritage is under threat now, greater threats than at any time in all of human history. And that's there are sort of four main factors that have led us to that point, or that are the greatest threats. The most visible ones are war and looting, but less visible but equally destructive, if not more so, are the intensification of agriculture to feed an expanding world population and the explosive growth of cities. Those last two, the growth of cities and the intensification of agriculture, are eradicating that material record of who we are. It's just getting plowed under. Just as an example, if you want to know how was Chicago founded, it was founded as a fur trading post where the Chicago River goes into Lake Michigan. No one even knows where that original Fort Dearborn is. It's somewhere underneath, maybe the Trump Tower, I don't know, but somewhere close there, no one knows.
Trump's private museum.
Well, we did a sort of an architectural comb-over, I'll say, of Fort Dearborn. But the point is that this heritage is gone. It's disappeared. Now, of all of those threats, the one that has been the most in the headlines and the most in people's awareness is the terrible destruction of our cultural heritage that has arisen through warfare and looting over the last, I'll say, really 14 years. It's dramatically expanded since 9/11. And it first came into people's consciousness through the destruction of the Bamiyan Buddhas, which many of you, I'm sure, remember. But it's not exaggerating, I think, to call it an obscene act of terrorism and cultural oppression in Afghanistan. The University of Chicago, the Oriental Institute, we've been working in Afghanistan in a partnership with the National Museum over the last 3 years, trying to help them rebuild from this kind of wanton destruction. I've spoken to people who worked at the museum who stood there when the Taliban came in to the museum with sledgehammers and smashed up every one of the earliest depictions of the Buddha in Gandharan art from the 1st to 4th centuries. Totally unique pieces. The Taliban would have executed them on the spot if they tried to resist. These people risked their lives. They waited until the Taliban left, swept up the pieces, and then secretly glued them back together again. So can you imagine this commitment of life and limb towards cultural heritage of a religion that isn't even your own? Because it's part of the shared tradition that defines Afghan culture and world culture. So those are kind of some of the stakes involved here. Now, this destruction of heritage and the looting of heritage, and those are two separate things, destruction through war and looting, illicit smuggling, have reached epidemic proportions, most notably in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria. And so it's at a crisis proportion, and no one really knows how to deal with it effectively. And that's what lends such immediacy to this project, the Past for Sale, that my colleague Larry and Fiona are working on. It's trying to engage with and wrestle with that problem. How can we deal with looted objects once they're out of the countries where the countries of origin? What the Oriental Institute is working on right now is trying to do some kind of palliative and repair methods, ways of dealing with the objects that are still in their country of origin. But it's gone so beyond that. It's globalism and transnationalism in its very, very worst incarnation. So it's an enormous problem, and it requires very creative ways of dealing with it.
So I just want to pick up where Gil left off and also add that in addition to the crisis situations where there are failed states in the Middle East that we're seeing on the front pages of newspapers, there's also this a global version of that, which is happening in everywhere from from China to Peru, this is a problem that has big dimensions and needs to be looked at in both in terms of the crisis situation response and from more distance in terms of what we can think of with regard to policies that might address the generalized problem of looting in particular. The problem of iconoclasm we've kind of bracketed for the purposes of focusing on the issues and asking what can be done about stopping the looting and smuggling and trafficking in antiquities. One of the problems has been that when you ask what is to be done, you get the answers that we've been getting from the stakeholders in the field haven't changed much in the last 50 years. So on the one hand, we have archaeologists and heritage professionals who say things like collectors are the real looters, ban the trade in antiquities, and enforce the laws that we have on the books, throw the book at the collectors. On the other hand, the collectors and the museum professionals and the dealers argue that archaeologists are basically complicit with nasty nationalist tendencies and with the kinds of laws that exist in the countries where looting is going on, which the collectors label retentionist. That's an adverb they like to use, that put these policies that say that everything belongs to the state and that therefore put antiquities at risk because the state is not doing its job of protecting them, and at the same time the state is not allowing them to be taken out of the country. So if the archaeologists are saying ban the trade, the collectors have been saying legalize it, and they're also calling for a return to the old methods of sharing the finds called partage, where at the end of an archaeological dig, you would split up the whatever the artifacts were that you found between the host country and the archaeological community. Thank goodness for that. Otherwise, we wouldn't have the Oriental Institute's incredible collection. So there are good things about partage, but whether it's a realistic suggestion is another question. And the fact that people have been saying this for 50 years now, it tells us that there's a problem. And in fact, if you look at the policy milieu, you find that there's been a stagnation in the development of new policies to address this crisis, which has taken deep hold in the last 10 years, but has been going on since the 1960s, at least in general. There have been no major new conventions, and if you look at the newspaper and you find that there are seizures of antiquities and big ceremonies announcing the return of antiquities to other countries, but in fact that focus does not you'll notice that they don't arrest anybody, actually, and they don't seem to be prosecuting anybody. So they're grabbing the objects, but they're not actually going after the looting networks. And that's a sign of a problem with policy and maybe with the tools that are available. So we're trying to rethink, we're trying to help generate some new policy thinking in this field. And we think three basic questions need to be addressed. One is, what is at stake when a site is looted? What does heritage mean? What is an antiquity? How do we understand what that is? For whom does an antiquity mean what? And those are kind of anthropological and sociological and humanistic questions. Then there are questions about the kind of property that antiquities are and what kind of good they are. And these are kind of economic or legal questions about how do you define who owns the past. And then there are a third set of questions about how does the market for illicit antiquities work? And that's a set of economic questions. So the Neubauer, and I can never say too many thank yous to the Neubauer family for funding this project. It wouldn't have been possible without them. Our Neubauer is bringing together economists, anthropologists, as Jonathan was saying, anthropologists, economists, art historians, sociologists, legal scholars, policy experts, people from the econ department and the business school, and also people from outside the university as well, to try to answer some of these questions. The first year we spent trying to establish some basic ground truths about who loots and why, how big is the market, where does looted material go, how does it get there, and who is involved in the system that brings an antiquity out of the ground and gets it, as Jonathan was saying, into the Getty Museum or onto the mantelpiece of a collector in Beirut or Abu Dhabi. So we were able to hold a conference in February in which we brought mostly archaeologists and people who study the antiquities market to talk about what we can see, what kinds of information we can actually generate, and what we actually can find out about where things go. So one example of this is a statue of Entemena, and that was actually not looted, but archaeologically dug up and brought to the Iraq Museum. And it was looted in 2003 during the US invasion. We know that statue, after being stolen, went to Damascus, and then it went to Beirut. And then in Beirut, it was put up for bid, and collectors from New York, from London, from Paris, and Tokyo all bid on it. Then somebody won the bid, and it was taken to Switzerland, and then from Switzerland to New York, where it was seized by the US because one of the bidder who had bid on it turned out to be working for the prosecutors there. So that was a success story, but it shows you how complicated these lines are. And so we've got several case studies showing how objects from different countries move through different networks, and we've learned that the transit points may change depending on whether there's a crackdown in one place or another, and that's complicated. And we can then sort of abstract out from that and develop models for how these networks operate, organograms or network studies. So that's one of the things that we've been doing this year. We've also been getting projects started to try to look at what we can find out looking at auction sales and the data from the auction market. Now, one of the things that's enormously complicated here is that the black market for antiquities is tied into illicit market, and we see the illicit market when people put things up for sale. But the illicit market also contains objects that weren't illicitly dug up. So separating the illicit objects from illicit ones and trying to understand what the illicit market can tell us about what's going on behind the scenes is a very difficult technical problem that we're working on. This coming year, we're planning to take the findings that we were able to generate in the first year and bring them to economists and policy scholars to try to do some market modeling and policy analysis. So in the second year, we plan to answer some of these questions. How can these empirical findings help inform models of the illicit market to help us figure out how it works, where the weak points are? And along with that, what kinds of lessons can we learn by comparing the antiquities market with other markets that might be similar to it? For example, the ivory market, or the market in human trafficking. So we're calling on economists who haven't actually dealt with the problem of antiquities looting at all, but may have worked on these other kinds of markets. And we're also dealing with economists that haven't dealt with these other kinds of markets, but have theorized different kinds of goods, repugnant goods, for example. And the third question is, can we put a price on the priceless? So that's kind of a econometric question. Because if we want to make policy recommendations, it's important to be able to have some sense of what the cost of the losses that we're seeing, the social costs are. We're hoping to also look at the different policy tools that now exist that in the field to address and try to control the illicit market, and ask what kinds of resources do they have, what do they not have, what kinds of factors make it hard for the police to do their job, what's the role of corruption in this whole situation, and it's a big role, but exactly how does it work in different countries? Those are issues we're hoping to look at. So finally, we hope to develop policy alternatives. We're going to ask whether there might be alternative regulations that might be put in place. Maybe a registry for antiquities would be one thing to think about. How should the market in antiquities be made more transparent? Right now, we don't know who is selling to whom. Even for when something goes up at Sotheby's, we don't know really who the seller is. That would be helpful probably, but we need to figure that out. Should there be a tax placed on antiquities trades to discourage people from buying? Are there other ways to pay for the costs to help countries that can't afford to pay for the site guards and the border patrol and so forth? Are there different kinds of technologies that could be put into play to help monitor the activities of looting? And finally, are there ways that we might be able to harness the market for antiquities to help pay some of the costs that it's incurring for all of us in terms of the loss of archaeological heritage?
Perfect. That's a great note to wrap up. Thank you, Gil, and thank you, Larry. So now we're going to have time for questions and discussion with both Gil and Larry. I'm going to get the conversation off to a start, and then just by show of hands, if you want to ask a question, I'm happy to call on you. Just want to remind you to speak up if you're at the back so that your voices travel to the front.
Oh, there's a mic.
Or Nina can walk around with the microphone. Gil, I want to start with a question for you. So in the past 2 months, there has been particularly intense attention paid in the mainstream media to what's happening in the Middle East with the loss of so many historic monuments, archaeological sites, and objects. And at the same time, there's been pushback by those who say that, in fact, this attention is misplaced. It's the suffering of human populations that needs to be the attention. So many of us have followed with sorrow the sufferings, for example, of the Yazidi population. So I wonder, how do you deal with that argument that statues need to come after the welfare of people?
Well, it's a very important question, and it goes right to the heart of what we do. The fact is that the scale of human suffering is it's mind-boggling. I was in Erbil in Kurdistan last summer, and every park in the city was filled to overflowing with refugee Assyrian Christians who had fled from the city of Mosul, which is very, very close to Erbil in Kurdistan. Tens of thousands of Christian Assyrian refugees had come to Erbil. And it was the kind of thing where you see both the best and the worst of humanity, that the ISIS was massacring them, enslaving them, literally enslaving them, expelling them. And yet the Kurds, who are ethnically, linguistically, culturally totally different, had opened their territory, their homes, their cities to these people. So you can never forget this. This is very, very important. And if you were faced with a choice, which are you going to save, a person or an antiquity, there's no question. I think we all agree on that. But what I would say, Fiona, is that it's not an either-or thing. These two go together. There's one of the things, the most chilling things I've ever seen was in Babelplatz in Berlin, where they had the public book burnings when the Nazis came to power, is a quote by the German poet Heinrich Heine, who said, "Where books are burned, people will end up by burning people as well." These two things go together. The destruction of people and the destruction of their culture are very, very often linked. And what we have to do as human beings is to try and combat both of those things. So I would say we are doing what we can in that part of the problem where we can do something. And we're doing it in the recognition that it is not in conflict with trying to save human lives, but rather everyone recognizes that destroying a people's culture is as effective a method of destroying them and wiping them off the map and out of human memory as anything else.
With regard to looting, we're lucky. I don't really know if I want to say that, but it's a fact that the looting that's going on in ISIS-controlled territories is helping fund ISIS's activities. We know there are links between looting and terrorism, although they're hazy, and it would be helpful to be able to know more. We know, for example, that Al-Qaeda had its training camp on top of the site of Messanak in Afghanistan. There was newspaper reports that Muhammad Atta had antiquities that he tried to sell in order to pay for flying lessons in Germany. We know that one of the ISIS leaders who was just killed had a cache of antiquities in his house. We know that there are reports that ISIS taxes and licenses the digging of antiquities in its territories. So in the case of ISIS in particular, there's a link that's demonstrable between the looting and the fueling of further activity by murderous groups.
So I want to ask another question. And this question is to start with for you, Larry, but then I'd love to hear Gil's thoughts as well. And that is, how do we make looting a scholarly enterprise? Because after all, if looting is successful, then there shouldn't be much for us to observe, right? If they're really good at what they're doing, then we don't know who moves what, where, who is paid by whom and when, and how things cross borders. So what is the work of this project to make those unobservables observable? What's the sort of evidence that drives this work? And while that question sinks in, I want to acknowledge a very special colleague who's in the room today, Professor Morag Kursel, who is a professor of archaeology at DePaul, and she'll be coming on this project next year as a visiting fellow that's made possible through the generous sponsorship of this Neubauer Collegium. And Professor Kursel is one of the world's leading ethnographers in how local looting networks actually work, how objects move across borders. So she doesn't need to feel pressure to respond to that question, but your thoughts are welcome. But I know you have insights into one piece of making the unobserved observable. And Nina's got your mic.
Give her the mic.
So who wants to take a first crack at that question?
Well, do you want to speak to that at all, Maura?
You guys go ahead.
Yeah.
So I would direct you to follow the POTS, which is Professor Kursel's project, and has fascinating information available about what she and her colleagues are doing to study and try to make visible on the ground relationships and activities, smuggling activities and looting activities it's very important. But I think that we need to think in two ways. One is what do we know, and then what are the known unknowns? There are going to be unknown unknowns with any black market. We don't know, for example, with human trafficking, how many people are actually being trafficked either. And there are lots of complaints about exaggerations in that field, as there are complaints about exaggerated figures being offered for how big the antiquities trade is. But we try to do the best we can by determining what we can know and then trying to find out more about it. So we can look at sites visually, and we can look at sites using data, where the data sources are very spotty and difficult to, and not easily manipulable. We have to work on auction catalogs that are not put into Excel spreadsheets for us immediately. So people have to spend hours translating the prices and so forth. But even when you get that data, as I said before, the antiquities market is very opaque. So there are limits to what we can find out, I think. But we're trying our best to develop innovative methods to try to estimate the value of things. And a project that we're getting started now is going to, hopefully, if we get funded, an additional project the FBI has invited us to apply for, will try to develop estimates of the value of artifacts taken out of the ground based on looking at adjacent sites that were archaeologically excavated and seeing how much came out of the ground there. So that's an example of the kind of thing we can do. We can also use and are using satellite monitoring technology, and people in the OI and Morag's group have been very active. I'm sure some of you have seen satellite photographs, and you can count the number of holes and so forth. But again, there are limitations even to that information. So the other side of this.
Should we let the archaeologists too add to?
Do you want to say something about the OI's?
How they study?
Well, it's interesting. What we're able to do is we can make reasonable estimates of how badly the archaeological sites are being damaged. My colleagues have shown me remote sensing images of North Syria, where you can see in the same image the archaeological site that looks like Swiss cheese. It's been so riddled with looters' pits. Then in the same image, you can see where the ISIS military headquarters is. And then you can see the paths leading away from the ISIS headquarters to the Turkish border. You can see where wide areas of the border fence have been cut. And then you can see the paths radiating outward from the cuts, almost like a palm tree. So it's very clear that's not things moving into Syria, that's things moving out of Syria. So you can sort of see the pathways, or I'll call it the traces of the pathways leading out, but what you can't see is the content of what's coming out. And that is the fiendishly difficult part of it, is to go beyond a crude level of monitoring to this very, very fine scale level of data that Larry's pointing to. Now, just to add to the fiendish complexity of it is, one, it's trying very hard to stay, the trade and the practitioners of the trade are trying very hard to keep it concealed. The second is it is extremely dangerous to look at these problems. My colleague McGuire Gibson at the Oriental Institute has brought in speakers from journalists from Lebanon who've had their lives, their children's lives, their families' lives threatened for even investigating the looting trade. So that's at the initial level, your life is at risk. And then as you move up the food chain, you run into an equally pernicious kind of thing, is that you go from being a thief and a fence to being a connoisseur. And then there's this tremendous power to great wealth, and people don't want to confront that. So at almost every level, it becomes really, really difficult to actually investigate this. But we should make no mistake about it, that really investigating this will be conflictual, and it will lead to great damage, actually, to the people who investigate it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Let's open up the discussion to other folks who might have questions or comments.
Yep. Can you use the mic? Thank you.
Yeah, just based on what you said, I was wondering about the end result. Someone who's got some good money buys this stuff. And you said there's a barrier around that, so I wanted to, why is that dangerous? I want to hear more about that. And also, has there been work on the psychology of the people, the motivations to have a stolen object that in some ways they have to keep secret, as opposed to spending the same amount of money in the art market on something that's legitimate?
Those are great questions, and my colleague, Maura Kursel, she's very well placed to answer the second half, which is the more interesting question. The first half is dangerous. You go from things that are danger to your actual life to dangers to your career by alienating very wealthy, powerful people, collectors who very often are major donors to museums and cultural institutions. So everyone who, even those who have a real stake in investigating it, they're intimidated to really go after the details of it. So that's the easy part to answer. It's just, you destroy your career, you don't end up dead. But the psychology of collectors is something that Professor Kursel has looked into, and it's really fascinating.
It is. It's very fascinating. So, is this on? Can you hear me? Oh, sorry. Great. So I'm grateful to the support of the Neubauer for next year, and I'm happy to be working with such great colleagues, because one of the things I'm going to be doing is working on a manuscript which is all about why people want to own Holy Land antiquities, because I work in Jordan, Israel, and the Palestinian territories, and why people want to collect that material. Tomorrow I'm heading out to Jerusalem, and I spend my days talking to tourists, collectors, dealers, everyone with a vested interest in the trade. So I'll be doing a lot of chatting with people to find out why they want to own these things. And it really is, you cannot imagine what my days are like and what people tell me. why they want to own these things and why they're willing to turn that blind eye to the fact that it might not have a nice object ownership history and it might recently have been looted. They're willing to just not think about that. I'll think about that tomorrow, or not at all.
Thank you. Let's take another question. Yes, right here in the pink. Yeah, yeah.
Hang on, I'm coming.
Well, I can try speaking well.
It's coming.
It's because we're recording it. So
Okay.
there you.
All right. It seems to me that the emphasis on the Middle East is very well placed at present. But looking to the future, looking sort of at the bigger picture, from my point of view anyway, all of this got started when the U.S. Sort of invaded, attacked some of the countries in the Middle East, Iraq, and further off, Afghanistan. And the ISIS and other entities are secondary. Sure, they're causing a lot of problem, but we need to look at the initiation of the problems as well as the problems themselves as they exist today. And I think it might be a good idea to try to look at where the future wars are going to be, so you fellas and gals can be set up to deal with issues in other areas. I go back to thinking about Native Americans and looting and destruction of the culture of Native Americans. It's happened all over the world, and I'm afraid it's going to be happening all over the world again. So we need to take a bigger picture, although, of course, the Middle East and the current issues are of major interest at present.
One of the things we didn't mention is that we have ancillary projects getting started to look at looting that's going on outside the Middle East. In India, in particular, there's a big problem of looting of idols from shrines that have been abandoned, so there, and that's a country that is at peace, more or less, but still is facing a major problem. China, as I said before, is experiencing a huge problem of looting now, with the rise of a middle class and a millionaire class that's driving domestic demand for its own past. So I think there are these crisis problems where the state breaks down, but there's also this more general problem of how does even an operative state protect antiquities in the light of the demand that's coming from all over the world for them.
Yeah, go ahead. And then,
yes.
2, 3, 4. Okay. Yep. Yes.
So,
go ahead. Get started.
2 questions. What are the big demand countries? And then are there things that we could be doing to tamp down demand? The thing that comes to mind in the ivory world, what we've done relatively recently, there was the essentially practical total ban on importation in the United States of ivory. And so it has at least a partial effect of demonizing ivory. People don't want it anymore because it's not cool to have it. Is there anything that we could be doing in a similar way with respect to the demand for these objects? And I take the point about the Middle East, where because of religious and emotional reasons, people want these things, but can we demonize it in some way that way?
Gil.
Well, I think you're getting at a piece of where the solution may lie, and it sounds very sort of kumbaya-like to say we have to change the culture, but in fact it's a very pragmatic thing, and you can think of several examples. Ivory is a very salient one. Blood diamonds is another one. Fur is another one. And I'll take it back and I'll say slavery is another one, that 150 years ago people didn't think slavery was, well, all that bad. And what happened was a group of extremely determined people, and enormous credit has to go to the British and the Royal Navy, that they decided we are going to eliminate the slave trade. We believe it's evil and we're going to suppress it. And they did. And they gradually, working with religious authorities, changed people's minds to view it that the very idea of owning another human being is unacceptable. Similarly, people, by and large, agree that ivory is unacceptable. The one place where I might differ with you a bit is to say that it's not only that we need to demonize the idea of buying this stolen art. This comes to this whole question of the psychology of collectors. They don't care about that. The interesting analogy is, all my wisdom comes from National Public Radio, and they have this wonderful series on social science. And they're talking about getting people in California to observe drought regulations. And on the one hand, you can really pass laws, pass regulations, really hammer people. But the other is a kind of a psychological jujitsu where you get people to feel virtuous by doing the right thing. I'm good because when I propose to Melissa, I'm not going to give her a blood diamond. Then people feel good about themselves, which actually, surprisingly, in psychology, is a very powerful motivator. So I think that this is one, it's only a little piece of it. There are other, the pieces that the Collegium project is working on also relate to policy things that the consumer countries can do to make it really, really difficult to get stuff in. So I would argue if we can do both of those tracks, then we have a really much better shot. Suppose you could reduce the antiquities trade by 80%. That wouldn't be bad.
I think that's a great question, and Gail has illustrated the kind of creative thinking that we're trying to bring to a very complicated issue. We have about 8 minutes left, and at least 4 hands went up. So Nina, could we take them in pairs?
Sure.
Okay.
Sure.
So, yeah, 5th row back, the gentleman in the, yeah. Thank you.
Gentleman here.
Yep, get started, and then
Okay.
the man in the suit right after, Nina, right near the window here. So we'll do you two right together.
All right, this is kind of a devil's advocate question. It strikes me as you gave the introduction that there's a chronic issue and there's an acute issue. Acute issue that we're most familiar with is the destruction of artifacts in the Middle East right now, rather than the removing of things for the wealthy and the whatever. And so, doesn't it strike you that in fact one of the solutions in the acute issue is to harness the smuggling trade to get things out before they're destroyed? This is somehow to use the pathways that are there to get the artifacts out before they're destroyed, and then worry about how to reclaim them afterward. Because once they're destroyed. And as long as you have the artifact, then you still have a chance to deal with the context that you want to.
Great.
Well-
Wait, we're going to let that devil's advocate question sink in a minute, and then just pass it right down to the row in front of you, the gentleman in the suit. Yes, go ahead.
Well, my question is, when it comes down to moving this artifact from the original places, there's a there's a trade-off here. So either we have to remove them from the context, from the place that they belong to, which destroys the context, or we have to leave them there. And in this case, in Middle East, they're in constant danger of revolutions coming up, wars breaking out, terrorist group taking over, destroying them. That happened in Afghanistan, happened by ISIS, happened during the Iranian Revolution. Like this piece that you have here in University of Chicago, the head of the bull, they had that in Iran, and they put a dynamite on them. And this is the best piece I think that you can find around the world right now at this point. You can't even find something like this back in the original place that this came from. So what should be the trade-off here? Should we leave these artifacts in the context, in the original places, and risk that they might get destroyed? Or should you just bring them out and actually utilize this kind of trade systems that exist, that bring them out and sell them to some collection owners, to museums in the West, or some safer places?
Mm-hmm. So 2 questions dealing with the pros and cons of moving things. Who would like to take a first crack at it?
Well, the problem here is to use the smugglers and the looters as the conduit to get things out means to allow them to dig illicitly, to dig up sites and destroy the sites in the process of removing the artifact. Once the artifact is out of the ground, then it either goes to a museum, it can be dug up by archaeologists, put in a museum, and then it's in danger of being smashed, or more likely with ISIS, which has been smashing the things that it couldn't sell, but has been selling the things that it could, it's just going to be coming out of the museum and go through the smuggler's route anyway onto the market. My point is that ISIS is destroying it's destroying a few images that are too big to to actually sell. And so it's not going to solve the problem to just say, open up the market and let the looters do whatever they want. Since the real problem here is the destruction of archaeological context by diggers who are trying to get the one pot that's worth money, destroying 50 other pots in the process, and all the context that would allow archaeologists to reconstruct the past if they knew where this pot came from and what was around it when it was dug up.
Gil?
Yeah, I think the question that the two of you are posing is, it's a really hard one because one wants to save these things. And in Afghanistan, for instance, there was a big push to create a museum in exile in Switzerland when the Taliban depredations were at their worst. But that doesn't really solve the problem. In fact, as Professor Rothfield's pointing out, it actually makes it worse. That this is an issue where we have to try and address it at the level of demand. People loot because there's a demand for it. It's economically driven. And no matter what kind of ideological veneer people like ISIS and the Taliban put on it, there's very often either a clear political or a clear economic reason for them doing what they're doing. So the kinds of policy questions that the project is trying to deal with are addressing or attempting to address ways to try to reduce demand. And that ultimately is going to be much more successful. There are tens of thousands of archaeological sites in these countries, you can't like do rescue excavations and save everything there. Even if you could get into the country, even if you had the money, you can't do it. So the only real chance that we have to protect them is by reducing demand and accessibility, ease of movement.
Disrupting the supply chain.
We're going to take one more pair of questions. Nina, there's a woman back here with the green blouse who's had her hand up for some time. Okay.
Two questions. I'm curious about, because of the colonial legacy for Western institutions like museums and universities, how we've gotten these artifacts in the early 18th, 19th centuries. Has there been pushback to a program, to your program or something that's similar on the global scale? And my second question is, it seems like it's such a difficult thing to study because all of these people are risking their careers and their lives even to investigate this. How are you building global partnerships to kind of get deeper into the problem, and where do you envision this expanding?
Okay, thank you. And then one more. Someone had a hand up for a while. Yes, sir, in the baseball cap. And then there should be a little bit of time after formal proceedings have ended if you want to come up and chat informally. Yes, go ahead.
Who's the leading law enforcement agency in the world handling these? Is it Interpol? And what role does FBI and Scotland Yard play? And is this the institute, this project staff, working with law enforcement in your investigations?
Okay.
Short answer is yes, they are working with law enforcement officials. It's a variety of different enforcement institutions, and a big part of the problem is the actual conflicts in jurisdiction between the different agencies very often mess up our chances at being able to really get good answers on this. And we, the Oriental Institute hosted a meeting with the FBI Art Crimes Unit just last week. All of us were there. They face as many problems as we do in trying to figure out how to deal with it. And a lot of it is because of interdepartmental rivalry. Remember after 9/11, what a huge push there was to try and better integrate our intelligence gathering. That hasn't happened with the enforcement side of things. So
even inside the United States, not to mention relationships between American and foreign investigators.
Does Interpol have a unit, division, specifically on this issue?
They do.
They do. But Interpol is not what the movies make Interpol out to be.
So to the first two questions that we asked, I'd actually like to address the part where you ask about the risks involved in this kind of work and the partnerships that we're forging through the project. So it was mentioned that in March, our project held a conference at the Delhi Center, the University of Chicago Delhi Center, a beautiful center. What was wonderful about that conference was that we were able to bring in specialists from throughout Southeast Asia, India, as well as Pakistan and Singapore. And as a result of that gathering, we now have a thriving partnership with with a grassroots organization that's focused on southern India that is working to combat the illicit trafficking of artifacts. So maybe this is a way of ending on a positive note, that there are very real risks involved. One of the ways that we can mitigate risks to ourselves is relying on easily available information and information from individuals who are involved with various aspects of this very complicated process of moving things. And the good news is that there are grassroots initiatives, there are people working as individuals who are doing things in their own communities to try to stop the illicit movement of artifacts. And those are the kind of glimmers of hope that we really want to nurture and build out to. I think that we're at the appointed hour, so we're going to have to let you go. Thank you very much for joining us.
Well, so I just wanted to say a couple of things. To start with, thank you so much to Professor Lear and to our panel, Gil Stein, Lawrence Rothfield, and Fiona Greenland. And also to say that there now follows an open house. We have, so you can actually see the Neubauer Collegium building and the sort of things that we're doing to try and bring people together and to integrate scholarship and connect them to other scholars around the world that they're working with. So that's sort of up-to-the-minute technology. There are also drinks and nibbles upstairs, so do enjoy the building. There's also an art gallery, and there's a very interesting exhibit in there called Salvaged Art, or Art Salvage, which is about works of art that were worth an awful lot of money, but because they have been damaged, insurance companies now set their value at nothing. So it's a very interesting exhibit. So do that. Also, I have been asked to just mention the university campaign, Inquiry and Impact, and that's been going, that went public in October, and our goal is $4.5 billion, not quite as much as Harvard's, but it's still quite a lot. We're about halfway there, but anybody who's a donor and all your engagement as alumni, we very much value, and do keep getting involved and keeping involved. Enjoy the rest of your weekend, and please stay and enjoy a drink and enjoy the building. Thank you.